Hey, welcome back, everyone. Well, today is the first day of the impeachment trials, and I'm sure some of you saw by now what happened. Basically, what happened was they have voted now to move forward with the impeachment. Basically, today was the day where they vote to decide whether they actually move forward with this trial. And as I've mentioned, this is not a normal trial. It's not even a normal impeachment. Normally, the Chief Justice would be overseeing this. This is overseen, run, instigated, and voted on because they have the majority by the Democrats. And so, again, they have 50-50 split. I think 6 Republicans voted with the Democrats. To be expected. All this means, though, is that it's now going to the actual trial phase. And from there, basically, we deal with the normal impeachment hearing. They had 6 Republicans vote with them. They need 2/3 majority. They're still far short. It's not. I think the chances of them getting those additional votes is very slim. But I'll be explaining this a bit more. Yeah, and a few other stories to go into tonight. And as always, yeah, good seeing you all. Yeah, how y'all doing tonight? Let's see. Belinda Sunshine. Hello. Hey, all from Florida. Good seeing you. Thank you. Coral Heads. You said good morning. Yeah, thank you. It must be morning where you're at. Yeah, Liz, Kim, Sarah. Good seeing you all. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. All right, folks. As always, I'm going to go over some news first. In the meantime, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. Yeah, from there, of course, we'll go back and forth as usual. And before we jump into it as well, folks, I have mentioned before that we are totally demonetized by YouTube. And so if you do want to support us, please do consider donating. We have Patreon and Donor Box. Donor Box is preferable because we've seen Patreon censor in the past. You can find the link to those in the description below. And also, we'll have to see what happens with YouTube. But in the meantime, I'm hoping we can stay on YouTube, hoping we can get things back up and running. But in the meantime, I still do very much appreciate it if you do like and subscribe. It does help this channel. All right, folks, that said, let's move into the stories. All right, so first off, this is Epoch Times on the impeachment. It says, Senate authorizes impeachment trial. It says the U.S. Senate voted on February 9th, today, to authorize the impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump, overruling an argument by the defense alleging the Senate doesn't have jurisdiction to try Trump because he's now a private citizen. Over the course of 4 hours, this happened over 4 hours, Trump impeachment managers and Trump's attorneys presented their arguments for and against the constitutionality of the trial. In the end, 44 Republican senators voted in favor of dropping the trial because it's illegitimate. 7 votes short of the majority needed to stop the proceedings at the gate. Now, the lead impeachment manager, Representative Jamie Raskin, a Democrat, argued that discontinuing the trial because Trump has left office would create a, quote, January exception, during which future presidents could abuse their power without fear of being convicted and barred from holding future office. First up, there's no precedent of impeaching a private citizen, but we'll leave it at that for now. All right. Raskin said this. He said, conduct that would be a high crime and misdemeanor in your first year as president, in your second year as president, in your third year as president, and for the vast majority of your 4th year as president, you can suddenly do in your last few weeks in office without facing any constitutional accountability at all. This will create a brand new January exception to the Constitution of the United States of America. Now, Bruce Castor, one of Trump's attorneys, argued that the idea of a January amnesty is nonsense. And he said this. He said, if my colleagues on this side of the chamber actually think that President Trump committed a criminal offense after he's out of office, you go and arrest him. So there is no opportunity where the president of the United States can run rampant in January at the end of his term and just go away scot-free. The Department of Justice does know what to do with such people. In other words, if he committed a crime, normally he'd be charged with a crime as a private citizen. You wouldn't need to impeach him. And this is an impeachment being done purely from within the political circles. This is a Senate and House impeachment, and mostly Democrats voting. Again, Democrats have a supermajority right now, 50-50 split in the Senate. And then technically the vice president is the tie-breaking vote. And of course, Biden's in, and Kamala Harris is the vice president. Now, again, to impeach Trump, they actually need a 2/3 majority, and they do not seemingly have a 2/3 majority at this time. Now, basically, what Trump is being accused of right now is inciting the breach of the January 6th, protest. I don't know if I'd call it a riot, to be honest. A January 6th protest where people breached the Capitol building, and where 5 people were killed, 3 of whom died from health complications, one of whom, Ashley Babbitt, was shot in the neck by Capitol Police, and the 5th one, an officer, which information is now coming out, appears to have died from the inhalation of the tear gas they were using, meaning that Trump supporters didn't kill nobody. They didn't do nothing. All right. But again, they're using this as the narrative to impeach Trump, and they're alleging that while Trump was giving his speech in front of the while Trump was giving his speech in front of the Washington Monument, that people breaching the Capitol building were doing so on behalf, We're doing so on behalf of Trump's call, basically. They selectively edited Trump's speech during the hearing today, where they removed the part where he said peacefully, peacefully make your voices heard, essentially. They removed that part. Again, they also don't mention the fact that Trump had tweeted, he had tweeted while people were breaching the building later on, go home, be peaceful, so on. They deleted that tweet, didn't mention it. Now, what's important to note, though, is that the arguments presented today were not actually focused on the actual January 6th incident. The arguments today were purely on the constitutionality of impeaching a former president, of impeaching a private citizen. Trump right now enjoys the same legal protections and legal consequences if he does something wrong that you and I have. And as Trump's lawyers mentioned, if Trump actually did do something illegal, which is what they're alleging, well, he's a private citizen. He could be charged under normal law. And so why are they having this essentially political court try him on something that isn't deemed legal by the normal courts? Now, the actual technical, so that's the argument today. The technical details of what happened on January 6th and where Trump is going to be going over this in more detail is going to be over the next couple of days. Let me go a bit more into this and I'll explain. Now, it says here, this is the article again. It says the people who breached the Capitol haven't been accused of conspiring with the president, Castor noted. In other words, there's no criminal argument on Trump currently. There's no criminal charges on Trump currently. It's purely the Senate Democrats and the House Democrats putting this case together, and they're acting as judge, jury, executioner, essentially, in this case. And normally, an impeachment of a president, you would have the Chief Justice overseeing it. Chief Justice Roberts is not overseeing this because the Constitution does not encompass what to do when it's not a sitting president being impeached, because there's nothing in the Constitution written about impeaching a former president, a private citizen. But Democrats are essentially arguing that based on their interpretation of the thinking of the framers of the Constitution, that they wouldn't allow a president to commit wrongdoing as they see it during his last days of office and not be impeached. And Trump's legal team is saying, well, there's nothing in writing that actually says that. You're making up your own laws, essentially. And in addition to that, if he did commit a crime as a private citizen, he could be charged under normal criminal law. So they're creating their own laws to essentially do this, basically. Now, and they can do it. This is the reality. They have a supermajority. They're the ones acting as the jury. They're the ones acting as the judges. And their votes are the ones basically deciding this, right? Now, let's go a bit deeper into this. Representative Joe Neguse, a Democrat from Colorado, cited 2 historical precedents from the U.S. Senate, including the impeachment of Secretary of War William Belknap, who unsuccessfully argued that the Senate couldn't try him because he had already been expelled. Neguse noted that the senators at the time were outraged by the proposition and, after deliberation, voted to proceed with the trial. And he said the Belknap case is clear precedent that the Senate must proceed with this trial since it rejected pre-trial dismissal affirmed its jurisdiction, and moved to full consideration of the merits. The defense argued in a trial memorandum that Belknap's case doesn't apply because he was not a president, among other reasons. Now, Trump attorney David Schoen argued that the trial should be dismissed entirely because Trump wasn't afforded due process in the House of Representatives. They rushed this through while he was still president because, again, this happened during his last days in office, right? They argued Trump wasn't afforded due process in the House of Representatives. They skipped some steps to do this, which voted to impeach the president without actually hearing witnesses, without presenting evidence, or allowing for committee deliberation. In other words, they skipped key parts in the normal proceedings of trying to basically hold what is essentially a government-run political trial, right? Which, you know, if you talk to people who lived under communist regimes, they'll say this, okay, this looks a lot like the show trials we had in communist China or the show trials we had in the Soviet Union, right? It's these show trials being done purely for political reasons, purely under political, political veils, I guess we could call it, right? This is a political move, not a criminal move. And again, that's the argument of the Trump team. If it was criminal, Trump could face criminal charges. This is purely within the realms of politics. Now, he noted, again, given that they skipped these processes during the vote in the House, right? They skipped again, right? They skipped due process. They impeached him. Voted to impeach him without hearing witnesses, without presenting evidence, and without allowing for the committee to deliberate. They skipped these three key steps, right? Now, he noted that Democrats' rationale for rushing the proceedings fell flat, considering that they delayed sending the article of impeachment to the Senate for 12 days after adopting it. And Schoen said this: the House leadership unilaterally and by choice waited 12 days to deliver the article to this Senate to begin the trial process. In other words, the House leadership spent more time holding the adopted article than it did on the whole process leading up to the adoption of the article. Now, Representative David Cicilline, a Republican from Rhode Island, another impeachment manager, argued that due process in the House wasn't necessary and that Trump would be afforded due process in the Senate, where he'll be given an opportunity to respond to evidence and was offered a chance to testify. Both sides used video clips during the presentations. Raskin played an extended clip of the crowd breaching the Capitol interspersed with the Trump speech that he gave at the same time and proceedings inside the building. The video showed that Trump was still speaking some 30 minutes away when a separate crowd breached the outer perimeter of the Capitol. Schoen played a clip of Democrat politicians, the one that Trump said he could put together, calling for Trump's impeachment beginning in early 2017. He accused the Democrats of using the impeachment for purely partisan purposes and warned that should the trial go forward, it would set a precedent for future legislatures to go after former officials based on the partisan whims of the moment. Now, I won't go too deep into this. We're going to be hearing a lot about this over the next few days. Basically, it's just what we said was going to happen, right? Basically, that the Democrats were going to vote 50 votes because it's 50-50 split in the Senate, that you were going to have 50 Democrat votes and probably 6 Republicans. 6 Republicans voted with the Democrats. And again, it was expected, right? When Rand Paul held his vote on the constitutionality of the idea of even impeaching Trump, right? As I mentioned before, only 5 Republicans voted with them. In other words, Democrats do not have the votes to actually move forward with the impeachment. Now, this does raise some questions, as I've been saying, of why they're actually doing this. Because, honestly, the evidence doesn't really line up with their arguments, frankly. The evidence doesn't line up. People were already breaching the Capitol building at the time when Trump was still giving his speech, suggesting that his speech did not actually incite the mob to breach the building. Trump gave no orders to breach the building. Trump said, be peaceful. They actually selectively edited a lot of his statements to remove the context of what he said. In other words, and they removed key parts where he actually said clearly not to do what they're accusing him of saying that he told them to do. told them be peaceful, so on. And the quotes they've used in order to make it sound like he did incite people to breach the building, right? The ones they actually did use, they took them out of context. And if you show the full clip of his statements, the context is obvious. For example, he's talking about, you got to fight like hell, right? They're using that as a quote. But taken in full context, he's talking about the legal proceedings. You got to fight like hell in the courts, right? He's talking about the legal proceedings. And if you watch the full context, watch the full clip, it's very obvious what he's saying. Now this, and I won't go too deep into it because we've discussed this quite a bit over the past few days, but again, as well, people were already breaching the Capitol building while Trump was speaking. Again, as well, basically they don't have the constitutional rights to do it. And again, as well, they don't actually have the votes to get it. They need 2/3 majority. They have 6 Republicans voting for them, meaning they're like 11 votes short. And one Republican from the Rand Paul vote, one more Republican has decided to vote along with the Democrats, purely on the constitutionality of this, not on the actual impeachment of Trump himself. And that's important to note as well. They're talking purely about precedent, purely about precedent, and purely again on whether it's okay to impeach a former president, and meaning that they actually may lose more votes. The Democrats may actually lose more votes as it goes forward. Let's see here. All right, folks, let's jump into some questions in just a bit. But just to kind of sum this up, where things are heading, basically over the next couple days, they're going to move forward with the actual discussions on the impeachment. They're going to be presenting evidence on this. It's, in my opinion, mostly inconsequential in terms of anything beyond the impeachment himself, which is why, as I mentioned, Trump is probably not, well, as he's stated now, he's probably not going to bring up any arguments on voter fraud or anything like that, because it doesn't actually matter in this current context, right? Because this is purely about whether or not to impeach him. The more arguments he brings in from outside the main focus, which is purely the technicalities of the nature of the impeachment itself, arguing that he incited people, which he can easily prove otherwise, because the evidence is pulled out of context, or just frankly it's not there. The evidence is on Trump's side. And as long as he can make sure that 11 more Republicans don't switch sides on him, he's okay. It doesn't seem like his interest with the impeachment is anything beyond that, and so he's very likely going to keep the arguments purely within those boundaries. Now, I've actually been thinking about what they're actually doing with this, and because it doesn't make logical sense, and I think I've come to some ideas on why they're doing this. It doesn't actually make logical sense to try to impeach him, because even Biden himself noted they don't really have the votes to impeach him. Even Biden noted this, that they had to go forward with it. Now, I've said before that there's really 2 main possibilities. One is, well, they've been talking about impeaching him since 2017, right? Since pretty much he came into office, they've been talking about impeaching him. Last year, around the same time, they actually tried impeaching him. Again, the House voted, the Senate shot it down. Same thing happened, essentially. Now, now they're moving forward again, and you could say that, well, they've just been saying they're going to do this from the get-go. This is their last shot to impeach him. Of course, they're going to try again, right? Because they've been trying it for the past 4 years. Madeline, you cracked me up. Yeah. It's reading your comments. That's one side of it, right? They're just doing it because this is just what they wanted to do for the past 4 years. The other possibility is that they're doing it because they want to establish precedent, that they want to establish the right and the ability to impeach a former president, not a current president, meaning this can be expanded. They could go after other people for previous alleged crimes, not through the courts, but through the government, essentially. This allows the government to basically charge people for crimes that they pretty much make up in this case, because it's not criminal, right? Otherwise, it would be through the police or the FBI and so on. It'd be through the Justice Department. If it was criminal, it'd be through that. They've essentially set themselves up as a political court through this to an extent, right? But actually, I've been thinking, and I think there's another possibility with this, which is, as I mentioned, and it's not being widely discussed right now, the Supreme Court is actually going to be hearing very soon, and this is after the impeachment attempt, the Supreme Court is actually still going to be hearing cases on the voter fraud allegations, including from Sidney Powell, including from the Trump team, including from Lin Wood. In other words, and as I mentioned before, we'll have to see how this turns out, but as I mentioned before, cases that were filed, in other words, legal cases that were filed prior to November 20th, before the Electoral College vote, anything that was filed prior to that could still overturn the election. And this would mean, we'll have to see how it plays out, because we're in wild times and we're dealing with a lot of things that don't have precedent. We're dealing with a lot of things that we've never seen before, right? So who knows how it's going to play out. But technically, any case that was filed prior to November 20th, prior to the Electoral College vote on the president, January 20th, anything filed prior to that could still overturn the election. And this actually does make sense why they would wait until after everything, because they would want to wait until they have a supermajority. They would want to wait until they had won over Georgia and won more seats in the Senate, right? Strategically, they would want to wait until they win more seats, because they knew the Georgia election was coming up and so on. It was in their interest to delay it until after those elections, until they have a supermajority and until they can do what they're trying to do right now. Maybe they're afraid, honestly. Maybe they're afraid that these legal cases actually could do something. The Supreme Court is set to hear those cases. Now, this doesn't mean the Supreme Court is actually going to hear them, because we saw what they did with the Texas. We saw what they did with the Texas lawsuit, for example. But the Supreme Court is set to hear the cases from the Trump team, from Sidney Powell, and from Lin Wood. This is moving forward, right? And so if they can impeach Trump before the Supreme Court hears those cases, which they knew was on the horizon, it means that pretty much it would be difficult to overturn the election at that point, because Trump would have been impeached. And if Trump is tried and found guilty by the political house that he's in right now in the Senate, right? If he actually is tried within the Senate and they say, okay, you can never run for president again, it's going to be very hard to overturn the election and say, okay, Trump actually won, here's your president, right? They wouldn't be able to do it. I've been trying to figure this out. This is now purely my own analysis. Take it for what it's worth, right? Purely my own analysis, but I'm trying to figure out what the reasoning or logic they would have for doing this and for delaying it. Because even as we mentioned in this article, the House itself even delayed things, right? We mentioned the House itself even delayed this for 16 days or something, like 12 days, right? They waited 12 days to deliver the article to the Senate. Why would the House wait like that? Why would the House wait like that while also skipping steps within their process? Right? It doesn't make normal sense. The only logic would be they did it on purpose. The question is, why would they do it on purpose? Well, the only reasonable logic, unless they're just doing things on a whim and there's no clear logic to it, the only logic to it was that they would want to wait until they had won more seats. They would want to wait until they had the majority, which is what they've now gotten. And now that they have the majority, they can push things forward and get what they want and do things as they please. And they do have a chance now of impeaching Trump, although very likely they're not going to have the votes to do so. But I personally, purely my analysis, and again, take it purely as that. This is not a hard conclusion, purely my analysis. Personally, I think it looks like maybe they're afraid that the Supreme Court is going to hear these cases, and maybe the Supreme Court's going to overturn the election, because a lot of those cases were filed prior to the Electoral College vote, meaning they could still impact the election. They could remove Biden from office, technically. It's going to be quite the ride, right? It's going to be quite the ride and quite the process to watch if that does happen. But this is the direction it's heading in. Now, Have to see what happens. Again, we're in a lot of uncharted territory right now, so we'll have to see what happens. All right, folks, go over a few questions. This is Paula Cheery. You said, Joshua, why aren't they doing something about the peaceful protests, and you say peaceful protests, going on in D.C. right now? Aren't military still in there? Yeah, well, what you're watching is the unfortunately politicized nature of law enforcement currently, where, at least in the Capitol, BLM and Antifa seem to be getting a free pass. It's catch and release essentially for a lot of them, and they don't seem to be acting on it. Technically, right now, as of yesterday, you had Antifa and BLM marching down the streets of Washington, D.C., chanting "Burn it down," alleging. Now, oftentimes the analogy people use on free speech, right? What are the boundaries of free speech? And even this is arguable, is that you can, say what you want, but if you yell fire in a crowded movie theater, that violates it. These are people not only shouting for fire, they're shouting to burn down, to commit arson, right? In the nation's capital. And yes, this is while you still have martial law essentially in the nation's capital, in some parts at least. And they don't seem to be doing anything about it. Why is that? If they're actually concerned about unrest, if they're actually concerned about threats to, national buildings and political buildings, why are they not concerned about this? That's a very valid question to ask. Personally, it just seems to be that we're seeing a lot of political-based enforcement of the law, selective enforcement of the law based on political faction. And Biden's team doesn't seem interested currently in going after people on their side of the political spectrum. Although we'll have to see how long that lasts, because already Antifa is turning against Biden. We've already seen Antifa hold protest against him. And what was the phenomena we saw during the peaceful protests over the past year? What was the normal phenomena we saw that usually ended the riots, right? The riots were allowed to take place. The CHOP or Chaz site was allowed to exist in Seattle until what? Until the protesters went and protested in front of the mayor's house, typically, right? They were allowed to go on until it started affecting the people in power. And as soon as that happened, time to clear house, time to send in the troops, time to clear their camps. It's over with. They were okay with the protests until it started impacting them. That we saw that repeated in New York. We saw it happen in Seattle. We saw it happen in many places. And so we'll have to see how long this lasts for Biden, because BLM and Antifa, they currently don't seem very happy with him. So we'll have to see. Let's see. This is from Misty Griffin. You said, would it be possible for states like Texas, Florida, and others to join together and create a new Republican States of America? Well, we'll have to see. So I did attend a Texit meeting while I was traveling in Texit. You can watch the interview I did with one of the main individuals behind the Texit movement. That's Texit is in Brexit, but with Texas leaving the United States. Now, just to be clear what my stance is on this, I personally don't think a breaking up of the United States is a good thing. I think a balkanization of the U.S. would actually benefit China. At the same time, though, I think the federal government has deeply overstepped its boundaries, and this isn't just under Biden. They've been doing this for a long time, frankly. And I think the discussions and debates that are going to take place within this movement are very good for our country to be having. Because what this is going to bring up is the arguments on where federal law ends and where state law begins, right? And it's gonna bring up a lot of arguments as well on whether, for example, as stated in the Texas Constitution, whether the government as we have it right now is still a Republican form of government, a republic, right? A constitutional republic, not a democracy. And keep in mind, America is a constitutional republic, or a federalism or constitutional republic, and this is different. Now, what is the difference between a democracy and a constitutional republic? Democracy is absolute mob rule, essentially. It is whatever the majority votes on is the new law of the state. In other words, things like a constitution wouldn't exist. This was actually George Washington's arguments against the Democrat societies going back to the early days of the nation. This was his arguments for putting down the Whiskey Rebellion, right? If you read his letters, in fact, I have them, well, you can't see them, they're up a little higher. If you read Washington's letters about this, he was concerned about the Democrat societies because he believed they wanted to do, well, they stated, it wasn't just a belief, it was a statement, that they wanted to do away with the Constitution because they wanted absolute democracy. A constitutional republic has other checks and balances in place so that you cannot, through mob rule or majority vote, just override people's values. The majority cannot persecute the minority, in other words, in a society, because there are checks and balances to ensure that doesn't happen. Now, again, the Constitution being a big one. Part of the Texas Constitution also says this, that they do reserve the right to leave the Union if the government is no longer holding the Republican form of government. And so this will be one of the arguments brought up in the Texit movement. Is our government still respecting the Constitution, right? Is our government still based on the foundations we were founded upon? Is government still protecting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And you can argue that is your protections of life, the medical decisions you make, for example. Well, that's under assault, definitely. Do the police protect you equally? Is there equal representation under the law? Currently, not in a lot of places. They could even argue in Texas that right to life would be right to self-defense, which you can make a Second Amendment argument on, right? Right to bear arms. Do you have a right to defend yourself if your life is under threat? A lot of them would say, no, I don't have that anymore. If it's liberty, do you have a right of liberty? Can you freely travel? Can you freely move? Can you freely protest? Can you freely speak? All of these right now are being impacted. Your right to peacefully assemble, right? Your right to protest, that is under assault. Your rights of free speech, under assault. And your rights of movement at this time, because of the lockdowns, are also under assault. They have a solid case actually in challenging that. And your life to pursuit of happiness, to start businesses, to build, chase the American dream, to build your own life. All of this now is being restrained through really a lot of government, well, many causes to this. You could say, technically, if you want to go after the big businesses, corporate reforms, which introduced communist elements within the corporate structures, going back to FDR and Lyndon B. Johnson, right? That happened. And also with the basic issues of, for example, you could even get into the monetary system and debt slavery and all the problems we've had with inflation and so on, whittling away the ability of a person to even have savings and buy a home and start a business. You could make arguments on all these things. I think this will be a very, very important discussion for this nation to have. And that's really my stance on Texit. Now, at the same time, with that said, after watching the speech in Texas and seeing what the basis of this was, now I was in a town of about 500 people. It was Kasi, city of Kasi. About 500 people, according to the sign outside the town. And in a little town hall in this little town, you had about 70 to 80 people attending. Personally, after watching that, I think Texas actually has a serious shot, including with the arguments they made, of actually being able to leave the Union. I think they actually may be able to do it. Now, if that does happen, you probably will see a lot of states go with them, because you can watch, there's a lot of arguments onto this. There were some court cases after the American Revolution, this Texas versus White, for example, which made arguments that you can't do this, that you can only break away from the Union if you, for example, there's a state vote and the states vote to allow you to do it, or if you successfully launch like a revolution, basically, which is ironic. Those are the two cases where you can actually leave the federal government. But as was noted, that itself is debatable in terms of the actual legal binding nature of that over a state is questionable, because it was a court case. It wasn't like a written law, essentially. It was a court case. It's precedent. And so that can be overturned. We'll have to see. Regardless, again, over the course of this coming year, because the vote in Texas is going to be in November, it'll be a very important discussion, I believe, for our country to have. All right, let me go over one more question, then I'll go over some more news for the day. Let's see here. You said, Michael Downing, you said the taxpayers are paying for this impeachment. Cost is $2 million. I'm not sure what the cost is right now. I do know that the cost of the Capitol Police, the National Guard, I was going to go over it. Cost of the National Guard in Washington right now is reaching about $483 million through March, $500 million almost. And quite a bit, actually, if you think about the state we're in. And it does bring up some serious arguments as well. Remember that during the presidential debates, one of the main arguments that Biden made against Trump was he said, "Oh, you're not doing anything with the virus. You're letting people die. You're not acting." There's all these political narratives. Now Biden comes in and he says he doesn't really have a plan beyond what Trump said, and says there's nothing we can do, essentially. So in other words, a lot of those arguments have already fallen flat. But what we have seen is that really what Trump did with handling the virus is he let states essentially govern. And Trump handled the international policy, travel bans with certain countries and so on, which is the normal function of federal government versus local government, right? Normally. In other words, the onus is on the states. And what were the states doing this whole time? They were trying to impeach Trump last year. And rather than deal with the virus, they were trying to impeach Trump. And rather than deal with the virus, they were trying to drum up all these new scandals. And rather than deal with the virus, they've been pushing for all these, vote changing policies and changing votes and such, rather than dealing with the issue that they're accusing Trump of being responsible for. That was the issue. And now you see them doing the same thing, right? Yeah. All right, folks, let's go over a few more stories for the night. Let's see here. All right. So this is an important part of this whole impeachment attempt. Trump actually offered to deploy 10,000 National Guard troops in Washington, D.C. ahead of January 6th, according to Mark Meadows. I'll go over this briefly. It says here, former President Donald Trump offered to deploy 10,000 National Guards troops in Washington prior to January 6th, the day of the Capitol building breach, according to former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. And Meadows told Fox News' Sunday Morning Features that although Trump had been vocal about offering Capitol Police a National Guard presence at the Capitol on multiple occasions last month, his offer was rebuked every time. And, of course, we'll have to see what happens with the arguments over the next couple of days as they actually go through with the trial period of the attempted impeachment. But Trump can actually argue, hey, I wanted there to be security at the Capitol. If you folks were actually concerned for your safety, why did you refuse the National Guard? Why did you reduce the presence of the Capitol Police? Why did you reduce security there? Why did you put stand-down orders on the? Why were there stand-down orders placed on some of the police? All of which happened. Maybe someone wanted people to breach the building, right? Just saying. Why did Twitter strategically, seemingly delete Trump's speech or Trump's tweets, two of them, telling people to leave and telling people to be peaceful? That itself would have been evidence enough to show that Trump did not want people to be violent, did not want them breaching the building. He told them to go home. Twitter deleted that history, right? Twitter erased that history. Erased as much as you can erase history at this point, though, because everything these days on the internet is, of course, easily saved. Now, we've talked a bit about what's happened with the Capitol breach. Here's another big story. Anyone remember Mr. Sullivan, the individual who was arrested, the individual who was part of this BLM group, the individual who was one of the people on the front lines of the breach who was right there when Ashley Babbitt was shot? And an individual who actually, by his own admission, has ties to Antifa, although he denies that he's actually a member, and an individual who is seen in his own Discord chats discussing pre-planning for the event. Well, there's an update on him. This is Epoch Times again. It says here, Capitol breach suspect who violated terms of pretrial release won't be jailed, according to the judge. Now, this is as Trump supporters who breached the building and didn't have evidence of pre-planning to this degree are still being held, some of them. And it says here, a Utah man facing charges in the Capitol breach incident will not be sent back to jail despite having violated the terms of his pretrial release orders, a judge ruled Monday. Now, while John Sullivan violated a release order by buying a smartphone, attempting to access Twitter, and trying to promote his organization, Insurgents USA, in an interview on InfoWars, U.S. Magistrate Judge Robin Merriweather declined to send him back to prison, according to BuzzFeed News. Merriweather expressed concern that Sullivan violated the order, but said she didn't believe he poses a danger to the community, according to the report, even though he's promoting his organization, Insurgents USA. All right. Anyway, according to the report, right? Now, she cautioned that if Sullivan continued to violate court orders, he may be jailed ahead of his trial, but said, quote, I don't believe we are there yet in this case. Now, I won't go too much deeper into this, but we can assume now that Trump supporters, as opposed to a BLM supporter who was ironically there for some reason and was discussing what he planned to do on Discord with his organization and so on, and by his own admission has ties to Antifa. We can assume now that Trump supporters will be treated with the same leniency, right? I think we can assume this, right, at this point. We'll have to see. All right, at the very least, it does set some precedent. At the very least, we can point to this as things develop, because this could point to political bias, at the very least, in terms of the way these legal proceedings are being done. We'll have to watch how things unfold. Remember that after Trump was elected, a lot of Antifa folks were actually arrested during some of the riots. They were all let go in the end with slaps on the wrist, essentially. Maybe we'll see a repeat of that, where people who've been arrested for breaching the Capitol building are also let go, but we'll have to see how this moves forward. Right now, we see leniency on the BLM Antifa types. We don't see leniency on the Trump types. Let's go a bit deeper in what's happening now. Now, separate story here, but important because something we've been following for a while. Now, we mentioned previously that the WHO, the World Health Organization, was going to be sending its own team to investigate the origins of the CCP virus, COVID-19, in China. And I've mentioned previously that, well, there's a reason why the Trump administration pulled the United States out of the World Health Organization, which was the WHO could not demonstrate independence, right? They could not demonstrate independence from the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I'll get into some of the details with this, but even the WHO organization doing this, right? And just so you folks know, I'm sorry, I'm probably being a bit tongue-in-cheek with the whole Trump supporters probably getting the same leniency. I tend to have a bit of tongue-in-cheek humor. I hope you got that. But I'm hoping they treat them with the same leniency. Honestly, at this point, I don't think we're seeing it, but we'll have to watch what happens. But back on the WHO and the investigations in China, let me explain what's happening right now. Now, the State Department spokesperson, Ned Price, said on February 9th that the jury is still out on whether the Chinese regime gave full transparency to the World Health Organization team currently in Wuhan to study the origin of the pandemic. I won't go too deep into this, but you have some overlap already being exposed when it comes to even the WHO group being sent there. Some of them appear to have ties with the Chinese government. And of course, if the Chinese government's narrative, Chinese Communist Party's narrative, has been, and they keep repeating it, saying that the virus is brought to China by the United States. If you're a CCP official, or if you're in any way tied to the Chinese Communist Party, and you say otherwise, you can be thrown in prison. This is a communist totalitarian regime. There are people facing charges in China, like serious charges, for far less than that, especially with something that has such deep impact on the interests of the party itself. The Chinese Communist Party's official line, and they've been repeating it over and over again, is that the virus was brought into China by the United States. Ironically, because in the early days of the virus, even in China, they were calling it the Wuhan virus, right? Wuhan, China. Now, the WHO sending their own team there, right? And basically, they're doing their own assessment. Now, earlier on Tuesday, the team of experts said that based on their findings, it was extremely unlikely that the virus could have accidentally escaped from a lab. U.S. officials in the Trump administration have hypothesized that the CCP virus may have leaked from a virology lab in Wuhan. Now, essentially, it seems that they're leaning now towards the CCP's narrative. And I've mentioned a few things on this. This is one of the ironies we have with this whole virus narrative. The Chinese Communist Party, again, is saying the virus is brought into China by the United States. We are actually not allowed to argue otherwise. Because if we call it the Wuhan virus or the China virus, that's considered a race statement right now. Despite the fact that saying the South African variant or the UK variant, naming the country of origin when we say the variants, is not considered, right? Is not considered controversial. Why is it then that while the Chinese Communist Party is trying to lie about the origin and change the narrative on the origin, if we talk about the real origin, you can be attacked? It means that you are actually not allowed to challenge false information being presented. And what happens if the arguments of a totalitarian communist regime are left without being challenged, and you're not allowed to challenge them? What happens? They win the argument. And right now we see the WHO, an organization that could not demonstrate its independence from the Chinese Communist Party, going to China to do this assessment with individuals within their own team with funky ties to the Chinese government. And if you're part of the Chinese government, you cannot break from their narratives. Doing an assessment is going to become the official international assessment on the narrative of where the virus came from. That's where we're at with this, right? Yeah, wild times, folks. All right, let's go over a few other stories. This is another one here. This is Epoch Times. It says GOP senators ask Biden to reconsider canceling a Trump regulatory transparency database. And I know this sounds like a lot of jargon, but this is actually a big deal. Now, it says here, 21 Republican senators want President Joe Biden to reconsider revoking his predecessor's, Trump's, executive order telling federal agencies to publish guidelines on how they interpret and apply regulations. Now, on his first day in the Oval Office, Biden revoked then-President Donald Trump's Executive Order 13891 that required the creation of a public database of agency guidance documents based on a bill in Congress with bipartisan support, the Guidance Out of Darkness or GOOD Act. And the senators told Biden this in a February 8th letter. They said, quote, "Without explanation, you describe this executive order as one of the harmful policies and directives that threaten to frustrate the federal government's ability to confront the COVID-19 pandemic, economic recovery, racial justice, and climate change. And you've claimed again without explanation that its revocation was necessary to provide federal agencies the, quote, flexibility to use robust regulatory action to address national priorities." Now, it's important on this. How does allowing the public to actually see how federal agencies are interpreting laws to create new laws, how does allowing the public to actually watch how our government does this something that goes against racial justice? How is public access to information something that goes against racial justice? Would it be that something within the way they're acting would go against racial justice? Right? Because all it is asking for transparency, right? Would allowing public transparency in terms of how the government is interpreting laws be something that goes against the pandemic unless they're doing something they shouldn't be doing? Does it go against climate change? How does it affect that? The only way I could think of would be that they want to interpret laws in ways that they themselves know maybe have some issues involved. And if they allow the public to see it, the public might be kind of mad about it, and it might inhibit their ability to create new laws for the policies they want to implement. That's the only possibility I can see with this. But if you have a government that's claiming transparency, that's claiming representing the people, that's claiming to, fight for the little guy, which is what they often say they do, why not allow those folks to actually see the way you're operating? Why not allow them to see how you're interpreting laws? Why not allow them to see the process and allow journalists like us here, right, to actually look at these documents and observe and see whether anything wrong was done in the creation of these new laws? Why was this done, right? Now, unfortunately, a lot of this stuff goes over people's heads because most media doesn't even cover it. I mean, really, if you were reading a lot of the mainstream media, you might not even know some of these executive orders existed. How many media were actually talking about Trump's policies and actually explaining Trump's policies? How many media talked about how Trump, for example, lowered the prices of insulin for diabetics by making it so that for big pharma, a big corporation, right, which you'd think that social democrats would be against, big pharma setting prices of medicine in ways that, way above cost to the detriment of people who suffer from diseases or health issues where they need to buy it to survive. Their life depends on their ability to buy it. And they're putting the price way above what is in any way technically ethical. Trump actually passed an executive order to lower those prices, right? Right. Trump passed an executive order to lower those prices, and Biden overturned that executive order. You have a lot of these things going on. Amon in Greek Jr. said, how many talked about the bat lady? You're talking about Dr. Xi Jinping. Yeah, well, they're trying to shift the narrative on her now, too. You might actually, again, check out the documentary I did last year, investigating the origins of the Wuhan coronavirus, where I went into a lot of the different trails of evidence on the possible origin of the virus. And, we, of course, talked about pretty much all the main narratives and looked into them. And I think we proved, for example, that the seafood market narrative, the live market narrative, was pretty much bunk. We do show some evidence of them creating, man-made viruses, chimeric viruses, which they've documented in their own writings. And we also showed some of the cover-ups that did take place, for example, in some of these virology labs that they do have in Wuhan. Personal assessment, I think the evidence points to the direction that the virus was a natural virus. I believe the horseshoe bat virus, which escaped from one of the labs in Wuhan and was able to spread and mutate from there. But again, we don't draw hard conclusions in the documentary. We show the different trains, including the possibility of man-made virus. Again, quite the issue, I think, if you go into the details of it. All right, folks, let's go over a few more questions here. This is from Paula Johnson. He said, why is the Senate allowed to decide if it is constitutional to impeach a former president? Shouldn't the Supreme Court decide such matters? Well, this is the way that the impeachment process is set up to an extent. Where, the House can basically vote to impeach, then the Senate has to actually conduct the trial. In a normal case, you would have the Supreme Court involved in the process as well. The Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, is supposed to oversee the whole thing. But because the Constitution doesn't actually include how to impeach a former president, because this is not a law in writing, it's merely an interpretation of the Senate Democrats and the House Democrats mostly, right, and 6 Republicans. It's merely their interpretation of a law that is not written. The Supreme Court justice is not doing this because the Constitution doesn't actually support this. And so, yes, the Supreme Court should oversee this. The decision to impeach technically is able to be done by the House and Senate. But the Supreme Court is supposed to have a role in this. Currently, we don't have any involvement of the Supreme Court. This is purely a legislative branch, House and Senate, impeachment of a former president, a private citizen like you and I. Now, this is from Sarah. He said, Joshua, I know you're working on a book list, but in the meantime, can you recommend any resources that explore dialectical materialism? Thanks for all your work. Okay, so it's actually pretty unfortunate, I think, that there aren't a lot of books that compile together in one place the information that I would like to present, which is why, as I mentioned, Crossroads team, we're going to put together a documentary series and a maybe a book out of the script. We'll have to see how it works, to basically bring together this information. There's only a few places I've seen really good descriptions of how dialectical materialism works. One would be Socialism by Ludwig von Mises. I mention it frequently on the show. Ludwig von Mises is great on this. His explanation of dialectical materialism is spot on. The other one would be a book by, it's a small book, and it's one of the books that I kind of write off normally because it doesn't look professional. It's self-published. But if you read it, it's actually really good. And the research is very solid. In fact, in my own work, I read through it and I fact-checked it and actually ended up using some of the sources of it in some of my other works. It's a book called Sword of the Revolution by Cliff Kincaid. It's very good, talking about dialectical materialism as the sword of the revolution. The only other source I can think of that talks about dialectical materialism is, really breaking it down in terms of analysis. And those of you who don't know, dialectical materialism has been called the living soul of Marxism. It's the element, it's the metaphysical theory, technically, within Marxism to manifest social movements through a tactic of inversion. It's described as identify, contradict, and eliminate the middle. It's the system, the technical tool through which communist movements can create social movements. And all they do essentially is you identify any cultural value, any cultural institution, anything you want to dismantle within a society. You invert it. You think of the inversion to that system, and you build social movements and arguments around the inversion. And you use that to agitate the incumbent system, to create social struggle through the struggle of opposites, as they call it. And that struggle of opposites is then used to whittle away the system over time, right? From Carrie Coogan, you said Sword of the Revolution by Cliff Kincaid. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the name of it. And Cliff Kincaid, that's right. I want to do something more in depth on this. I also did an article some of you might be interested in reading. It was called Communism's Secret Weapon, or Communism's Secret Tool. I can't remember the name. It might have been Communism's Secret Tool, where I go into a pretty in-depth breakdown of dialectical materialism, actually. And it's important to know. I mean, a lot of people, when they think communism or socialism, and they just think, oh, it's an economic theory. It's about community. It's about sharing. It's about fighting for the little guy. No, that's just the narratives they built around social movements. And even within the boundaries of socialist movements, you have tons of different interpretations, many of which don't like each other. They don't recognize each other as legitimate. But if you understand communism, the heart and soul of communism, all this just makes sense, right? This is just how they operate. I would argue that a lot of these folks don't even... I would argue a lot of communists don't even know how this stuff works, to be honest, because you have to really read into it quite deeply, actually. I would argue that Mao Zedong understood it pretty deeply, and I would argue that Karl Marx, of course, knew it inside out. But I would say a lot of the revolutionaries probably don't even know how this stuff works, to be honest. Let's see here. This is from Ron Buckner. You said, Josh, what do you think will finally trigger the American people to revolt? Will we give our country to China because of our complacency? What will cause the American people to revolt? I mean, I don't know. I'm personally not a fan of revolt. Personally, I think that a open discussion, a refusal to be silent, and a refusal to surrender your values, and a using up the grassroots in the country to legitimately challenge things, as Trump is trying to do now with his office of the former president, can actually do quite a bit of good. The issue I have, and this is something that I've had a lot of trouble with, if you really understand the way communist movements work, they want there to be fighting in the streets. They want there to be struggle. They want class struggle. It's actually not about these, movements even, which is why typically when communist movements take over, they tend to execute the people who run the movements to agitate the society. They tend to execute them. If you go into, not to get too deep on this, but if you go into how dialectical materialism was formed, you get into the Hegelian dialectic, which was the leading metaphysical theory in a lot of Europe during the time of Marx. Really, if you get into the history of it, it's really interesting. The Hegelian dialectic was a theory about the process of basically how things change. So they talked about, for example, the negation of the negation. And I know this sounds cryptic, and even Marx himself criticized it as sounding too cryptic. But this is basically how it worked. The negation of the negation of an existing institution or the negation of an existing circumstance. Through the destruction of that, a new system is born. They would say that basically anything that is destroyed leads to the creation of a new institution. Hegelian dialectics would explain it like through the negation of an egg, the chicken is born. Through the negation of the seed, the plant is born. Through the casting off of the system through which something grew, you have the birth of a new system. And this was what Marx took and adopted to create his theory. He said, oh, well, then through the negation of all previously existing institutions, we can create a more highly evolved society, right? That was the idea. And so he created a system designed purely to destroy all previously existing institutions, the sword of the revolution, dialectical materialism, merely creating institutions and social movements designed purely to whittle away at, to wear down, to challenge, and to eventually destroy the morals, traditions, values, basic institutions, whether it be government or family or law or religion and belief and everything that makes us who we are, that only through the destruction of everything could you have the communist utopia, this imaginary city on the hill. And, the interesting thing is if you actually go back, the thing that they write off as well, you can say the destruction of the egg gives rise to the chicken, but look, the destruction of the chicken leads to death, right? That you can destroy things, cast off a circumstance and have something new come about, but that's to an extent until you actually destroy something and it just dies, right? Destruction doesn't always lead to rebirth. There's all kinds of holes in the theory if you go back into the arguments with it. And actually, it's interesting that if you go back to the actual arguments, even at the time of Marx, and Ludwig von Mises actually talks about this in Socialism. Technically, socialism and before the Bolshevik Revolution, socialism and communism were used mostly interchangeably. Socialism could be seen as the system in practice. Communism is the belief. It's the idea of what socialism will create, basically. If you go back to the time of Marx, technically, socialism was dead as an argument because it could not withstand debates when it came to economics and sociology. It could not withstand debates within those realms. What Marx did was he actually came out and created a new argument. And he said, well, communism is of the future. And so you actually can't argue how it would work. You can't argue that it wouldn't work because you can't argue what it will actually look like. And then he argued as well that the economists and sociologists were the bourgeois intellectuals, and you don't have to debate with them. And pretty much his statements that you don't know what communism will look like led to all kinds of random communist movements starting up pretty much across the whole spectrum. Technocrats, the Owenites, even though that predates Marx, the economic socialism, military socialism, Christian socialism. You had the communist church, for God's sake. All these things sprang up and ran through different elements within every society. And one thing that Ludwig von Mises notes in Socialism is one of the problems we have even debating communism at this point in our society, and this was like 1930, is that a lot of things that people on the right and the left argue against actually came about through state interventionism, which came from socialism. A lot of the things that people on both the right and the left don't like about society came about through the introduction of socialist ideas. And, we tend to debate with each other running in circles because of this. It's, personally, I've been thinking of how to explain these things, to be honest, because it's such an intertwined knot at this point. But I think there's a way, and I do hope in my work that I can help break some of the stuff down. Now, sorry for that long kind of side note, but again, we're going to be doing a series on this, and hopefully I can start to break some of these things down a bit better. All right, folks, it's getting quite late, so let's end it here. As always, really appreciate all of you. Always enjoy these conversations. I mentioned before, we are demonetized by YouTube. If you do want to donate to Crossroads, we do have a Patreon and a donor box. I do recommend donor box over Patreon. You can find the link to those in the description below. And also, we are hoping to stay on YouTube. We'll have to see what happens. But in the meantime, it does help us if you like and subscribe and share this video. It really does help us get the word out. And it does help us in terms of SEO and such. Now, folks, as always, really appreciate all of you. Always enjoy these conversations. Of course, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.